Good morning. For those of you who are zooming in from the United States, happy Monday. Hope you all had a restful and fun 4th of July weekend. And for those of you who's tuning in from Asia, good evening. Welcome to the Stimson's webinar on a reflection of a late former Prime Minister Abe. I'm letting everyone into the Zoom room. So if you can give us a couple of minutes, we're going to get started. Thank you. For those of you who just tuned in, good morning, good evening, wherever you're tuning in from. We're letting everyone into the webinar, so we're going to give everyone enough time to sign on to it for the moment, and we'll get started in a minute. Okay, I think we're going to get started since we only have an hour. So, and obviously, Mr. Miyake is tuning in from Tokyo for us, so we don't want him to his bedtime to be late, too late. Good morning for those of you again. For those of you who are tuning in from the United States, hope everyone had a good 4th of July celebration and had a good weekend. For those of you who are tuning in from Japan or other parts of Asia, good evening. Thank you for tuning in so late over there. Welcome to STEMS in Japan Program's webinar called Revisiting the Legacy of Shinzo Abe. On July 8th, just today, 2 years ago today, as we all know, the world faced shocking news. Former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was assassinated during an election rally where he was doing a stump speech for his fellow LDP candidate supporters. During his decades-long political career, Mr. Abe emerged as one of the visionaries for the future course of Japan. And since the departure of him, the strategic vision he laid out during his prime ministership for Japan continued to blossom under his successors. Most recently, the incumbent Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, who is coincidentally set to visit Washington, D.C. tomorrow to attend NATO plus Asia Pacific 4 Summit. So today, I'm very, very delighted to be able to engage these two gentlemen in the conversation, reflecting on the evolution of late former Prime Minister Abe as a politician, as a statesman, and what his legacy might be moving forward for Japan. First, let me introduce to both of the speakers real quick, and I will start off with each of them with one question, and then after that, each for one speaker, and then we'll get right into the Q&A. So for those of you who would like to ask speakers a question, please do utilize the Q&A column on the Zoom screen. Please do not use the chat screen because those are saved for panelists, me, and our communication team who are doing the troubleshooting for any potential technical difficulties. First of all, I'm delighted to welcome again Mr. Kunihiko Miyake. He's a board member and a special advisor for Canon Institute of Global Studies headquartered in Tokyo. Miyake-san currently serves as board member of the CIGS, where he had served as the research director for foreign and national security affairs for the last 10, 15 years or so. He also has been dual-hatted as a visiting professor at Ritsumeikan University. Before then, he has nearly 30 years of distinguished career with Japan's Foreign Service, which he retired in 2005. And again, the second speaker, I'm delighted to welcome to my show. I think we've been on the panel a couple of times together, but I think this is the first time for me to host him. I have Mr. Tobias Harris. He's a founder and principal of Japan Foresight LLC. Tobias is a leading expert of Japanese politics and widely quoted in leading world publications and a regular guest on television and radio programs as a close monitor of Japanese domestic politics and foreign policy. He recently founded the Japan Foresight LLC, which is a Japan-focused political risk advisory firm. And he also is the author of the Iconoclast, which he's showing in his background, which is so far the only English biography of late Prime Minister Abe. So, well, gentlemen, thank you again for the show, to coming onto my show for an hour. Looking forward to our discussion. So, because this is really to reflect former Prime Minister Abe's legacy, not just during his tenure, but also as his whole career as a politician. Let me first ask this question to you, Miyake-san. I know you have actually at some point at the very early start of your career, literally worked side by side with Mr. Abe. And since then, you really stayed close in and out of the government and throughout your career as more like a personal friend. So from your view, how did Mr. Abe evolve over time from the time that you first met him through, right up until we tragically lost him?
Well, thank you for having me today. Today is the 2 years ago he passed away, and I still miss him, and we all still miss him. The first time I met him was in 1983. Today, by the way, I talk about something I have never talked about before. I mean, because sometimes it may sound personal, but I have to say this. Shinzo was a private secretary to the foreign minister, his father, back in 1983, when they came to Iraq. And I was an Arabic language officer, and I was an interpreter between his father and the Iraqi officials. And of course, naturally, I collapsed in the middle of the translation. So I was suddenly sort of out of the blue, I was replaced by another interpreter. It was a huge shock for me. That was my first and the last performance as an interpreter between Arabic and Japanese. So I was so devastated and I was so sad. And when we saw them off at the airport, and then I was at the bottom of the stairs, and Shinzo came to me as the last person to go up. And he said, "Thank you, Mr. Miyake. Thank you very much." It's just a short message, but I was so surprised because he remembered my name and he knew that I was devastated. But he was such a kind person. He was such a personable person. He's got all the elements that every single great statesman should have. Number one, he's a very amicable, nice person, and everybody loves him. And he can disarm anybody, including Mr. Trump. And that's exactly the reason why he was so successful in the international arena. But that is not the only virtue of his. The second thing I noticed is that he may not be a rocket scientist, and I don't know how well he was in the schools, but he has a good memory. He has a strategic sort of perspective. So he always thinks strategically. So of course, he has to deal with tactical issues, but he always tried to be strategic in doing anything. So I was so impressed by his performance. Fortunately, I never worked for him directly. I worked for his wife as an chief of staff to the spouse of the Japanese prime minister for the first time, maybe the last uh, uh, chief of staff as well. But I through her, I've been in touch with him all the time. So he is strategist and personable strategist, but at the same time, also when he developed his political career, I realized that he's not only a strategist and he's not only a good person, but he's well, I don't believe in this usually, but he's a grandson of late Prime Minister Kishi, um, Nobusuke Kishi. He when even he was when he was in elementary school, um, he started talking about politics, and I think it's a DNA of his, a DNA of the Kishi family. I don't know, I cannot explain that, but he is such an what shall I say, uh, politician by birth, and he could do it so naturally, and that's probably the reason why he has been so successful in his career. Um, when he was assassinated, I was in Tokyo, but I was so shocked and I couldn't sleep that night. What a big loss we suffered on that day. And we had a big gathering yesterday, remembering Mr. Shinzo Abe. A lot of people gathered, but everybody missed him. So I just want to know how Toby remembers him as a statesman or the politician or prime minister. Thank you. Sorry, I'm too emotional.
No, thank you. And that was really special. And then you're right. I don't think any of us heard this kind of story before about Mr. Abe. So, and I could also glimpse, when Mr. Aso actually visited Mr. Trump to Trump Tower, first thing, Mr. Trump mentioned was actually not Mr. Aso, but Mr. Abe's name, and said we all miss him. So, and then I think I do believe he was genuine when he said that. So.
Yes.
So, Tobias, you, as you wrote the book, you observed those histories from outside in look. And that included, of course, your personal interview with Mr. Abe himself. So from your perspective, as you wrote the book, what struck you as the most about his evolution as a statesman?
Thank you, Yuki. Thank you, Miyake-san. Just it's always really appreciate hearing your thoughts as well. It's really a honor being on this panel. So, I mean, I think, as often I think things work with legacies, it always helps having a little distance and a little time. And I think, with 2 years now, with Mr. Abe gone, I mean, I think we've learned a lot about the impact he had. I think we've learned a lot too about the role he was still playing even after he had left the premiership. And I think the last couple of years of Japanese politics, the current moment of Japanese politics, looks very different if he's still alive and active. And so I think the um, his outsized role that really continued up right up until the moment of his death. I mean, I think I think we see his importance in how Japanese politics has gone for the last couple of years. I mean, just in terms of thinking about his legacy, I mean, I think there were several concrete achievements that were uh, fairly obvious at the time, at the moment, which I think we can look at both institutional change, the fact that he was a centralizer and a modernizer, and really had taken several decades worth of reforms to strengthen uh, how the Japanese government functioned and how decision making in the Japanese government functioned, making it much more centered on the prime minister's office, and particularly national security functions. So, building up the national security secretariat, developing the capacity for producing a national security strategy, which I think has been a very useful exercise for the Japanese government to do, and to really put its thinking out there and really articulate how it's governing. I think strengthening political leadership over the bureaucracy, which again has, I think, pretty strong national security implications in terms of the government's ability to pursue the policies it wants. I think just changing the direction of defense spending, which of course it's hard to remember now that it had been stagnant right up until he returned to the premiership, and that has not been the case anymore, and sort of changing the direction that is going. The national security laws probably are only more important now than they were in 2015, and so I mean there were those kinds of changes. I think just the overall blueprint for Japan's foreign policy that he laid out, we're going to center relations on the United States and do whatever we can to bring the U.S. into the region, but we're also not going to be content with that we have to have this, what are they calling it now? The lattice network of relationships between U.S. allies, and sort of moving away from the hub and spokes model to something a little more integrated, and the kind of, I mean, we're going to see it this week with Defense Minister Kihara in the Philippines. I mean, there's just all these relationships that grew out of his efforts, and that personal diplomacy and relationship building that he was determined to use. And so all of those, I think, are sort of tangible achievements. But I think even if we step back, and I think this is from the vantage point of 2024, I think this is even more clear. But when Prime Minister Kishida took office, I wrote something saying that Kishida might turn out to be Abe's greatest legacy, by which I meant that if you look at the LDP now compared to 2012 when he came back to the leadership, and even to the early 90s when he first entered politics, I mean, it is a different LDP. It is a party that is much more uniformly committed to his vision, to his the centrality of pursuing constitution revision, national security as sort of a paramount goal and effort, and the kind of blueprint that he laid out for Japan's foreign policy. And so, I mean, when Kishida became prime minister, I asked, what does it mean for a liberal or dovish? What does it mean when he says he's liberal or he's dovish, or that the Kochikai is a liberal or dovish faction? That is there anything? Does that have any meaning anymore? And I mean, I think after nearly 3 years of Kishida, I mean I mean he clearly has embraced Abe's view of the world and Japan's place in the world quite, I mean, I think wholeheartedly, and has pursued. And I think what Kishida has also shown that the Abe blueprint is not just something that that Japanese leaders are following mindlessly, but rather it's a set of tools. It's a way of looking at the world that can be adapted to new circumstances. And so we saw what Kishida did after the Ukraine war started and the decisions he's made, that it's more of a mindset, it's more of an approach that is adaptable, and that will guide leaders going forward, but it's not a straitjacket. And I think that I think we've seen that going forward. And I think we will continue to see that some of the issues that earlier in Abe's career were quite controversial, and things that made him a figure of controversy are no longer controversial. And that, I think, in some ways is his greatest legacy. I mean, given the kinds of challenges Japan faces in this decade and at the current moment, I mean, clearly that kind of awakening, as our friend Andrew Oros has talked about Japan's security renaissance. I mean, that his role in that, I mean, it is essential, and that, as the U.S. has questions about the role it's going to play in the world, and its ability to play the role that it's played in the past. I mean, clearly there's a space that Japan needs to fill, and that has become possible, through the institutional reforms and the policy changes that we saw during Abe's tenure.
Thank you for that thought. So
Yuki,
this
may I jump on
of
jumping
course,
on that?
of course.
I think after listening to Toby's remarks, I realized that the Shinzo Abe, Yoshihide Suga, and Fumio Kishida, it is a one administration. The starter, the middle, and closer, sort of a baseball game. Okay, and Shinzo was sometimes sort of misunderstood as a hawkish politician, but he is very practical, realist politician as well. And about having said that, Fumio Kishida looked so dovish, so that's why he could finish the game. He could close the game. If Shinzo stayed on, maybe the 2% might have been much more difficult. Thank you.
Thank you both for that thought. And this is a great segue to kind of modify direction of our conversation a little bit into more focused discussion on foreign policy area. So if you look at it, Mr. Abe's legacy, he's really visionary in some of the investment that he decided to make as a prime minister on his foreign policy agenda. Doubling down on alliance was, one thing, but then also I think when he declared in 2013 in Washington during his speech that Japan is going to be the first-rate country, Japan is going to be the defender of the commons, Japan is going to be the leader in the protecting of the liberal, international order. And also he already had spoken about confluence of the two seas, Pacific Ocean and Indian Ocean. And, under his leadership, Japan's engagement toward what we now call global South really blossomed, such as, he really invested his time and attention to something like Tokyo International Conference on African Development, bringing that summit, for the first time in Africa. And I think so some of the thing, in a sense, Miyake-san's analogy is very suiting that, he started this course for Japan to fill. And Mr. Suga, during the COVID and everything, he was a great nakatsugi, the middle. And with, Mr. Kishida's more soft, quote unquote, personality, like you alluded to, really allowed leadership to finish some of the unfinished tasks that might have been much more politically controversial under Mr. Abe. So 2% is one, counter-strike capabilities is another one. But I think above all, I think what Mr. Abe did during his tenure was he really normalized the conversation about security. So no one really goes in panic in Japan when political leader talks about security threat that Japan faces. And in a sense, to me, that I think is a really, really big legacy that he left as a statesman. But starting with you, Tobias, my second question is, so you already touched upon some of the domestic institutional changes that Mr. Abe basically, fulfilled, which kind of started way back when Prime Minister Hashimoto started to centralize the office. Mr. Koizumi kind of picked it up and moved the ball a little further, and then he took it even further. When you look at foreign policy, what do you think, including U.S.-Japan alliance, what do you think are some of the greatest legacy that we still see blossom? I mean, you touched upon already some of that, but if you can elaborate on that a little bit more.
Sure. I mean, I think one thing that we haven't discussed, but I think is firmly within his realm, the realm of foreign policy achievements, is, and our friend Maria Solis has also written quite substantially about this, but that Japan went from being sort of a reluctant, quiet participant in free trade talks and maybe, pursuing bilateral FTAs that were maybe good for Japan, but were not, it was not a broad rule setting project. But Abe's decision to bring Japan into TPP in 2013 over, I mean, it's always funny when you look at, the surveys the newspapers do of the views of, of candidates for office. And, if you go back and look at those surveys from 2012, of the 2012 general election, I mean, the number of LDP candidates whose views were anti-TPP. And despite that, he made that decision. But the consequences of that are that Japan has embraced leadership in global economic rule setting to an extent that we just had not seen before. And that that when it talks about upholding a rules-based international order, I mean, it means what it says. It is committed to that. So, joining TPP, being part of the process, then reviving it after the U.S. pulled out, completing the bilateral FTA with the European Union, which, given the size of the economies involved, I mean, it really is an act of rule setting. The kind of leadership we've seen in the G7 under, when Japan was G7 president under Abe, and then several years ago when Kishida, or I guess 2023 when Kishida was hosting it, that this has been, Japan has used these opportunities to move a global agenda forward in a number of different ways. And that is just tremendously important, again, because the United States has stepped back in so many areas and is less eager to play that role. Someone has to step up. And Japan, I think, what both under the Abe government and his successors, recognizing that, and not least because of political stability, Japan actually is able to speak with one voice, to speak coherently on these issues in a way that both the United States and the European Union collectively and European countries individually are not necessarily able to do. And so, Japan, I think, has an appreciation that it has benefited at least as much as any other country from a rules-based order, and that it has a lot to lose from its breakdown, and is willing to put its money where its mouth is. And then that also, as you noted, includes in the global South, and recognizing that that the G7 can't just write off the global South to China and Russia, and that it has to be there. It has to be willing to invest. It has to be willing to listen. All of that is very much, I think, a part of Abe's legacy. And so, I mean, I think it would be incomplete to not highlight that and to not flag that. I mean, but we've talked about the defense policy initiatives and legislation, but in terms of really changing Japan's place in the world and sort of a tangible embrace of a new role, that in some ways might be more important, that that Japan within that sort of G7 framework now is active and vocal and in some really a leader in every sense of the way.
Thank you. Miyake-san, any thoughts to add to this?
Yes. Of course, Shinzo was a great statesman, and he has enough sort of good characters and amicable sort of character. But that's only one part of his success successful political life. You see, in my view, politicians or statesmen cannot be born alone. I mean, the time creates prime ministers. So in the case of Shinzo Abe, the Shinzo Abe 1 and 2, version 1 and 2 are in a sense, from success-wise, probably the second Shinzo Abe 2 is much more successful. But what Shinzo Abe 1 well, what he said in 2006 and what he said in 2012 for the second, when he became prime minister for the second, he was talking about exactly the same thing. So he hasn't changed at all. So what has changed? What's the difference, do you think, is that help him be more successful for the second term? That's China. See, when he became prime minister for the first time, 2006, it was in a sense premature. What he was saying didn't resonate, didn't echo, because at that time there was no Senkaku incident. There's no sort of assertive foreign policy of China. But, remember, they came to Senkaku Islands in 2010, then again 2012. That's exactly in the middle of the LDP presidential election when he was running for the second term. And probably, I shouldn't say this, but I told him personally, you see, you should thank Beijing because otherwise you cannot be elected again. And he just laughed. But actually, without Senkaku incidents, the majority of the Japanese people may not have realized that they needed Shinzo Abe more badly than before. So I think he was also a lucky politician as well. You're muted.
Yes, thank you. It took me a little bit to unmute myself, but yeah, I think what you mentioned about maybe Prime Minister Abe when he first became the prime minister, he was like a little bit too ahead of the curve of everybody at the time, and I guess U.S.-China strategic competition was in a very different place back then as well. So you're absolutely right; it didn't quite resonate. But I was reminded when I was hearing both of you, and especially Tobias on the Toby on the trade side of his political legacy it is true. I mean, for those of us who remember Japan's infamous non-tariff barriers back in the 1980s, it is almost a sea change to see Japan as the kind of as it tried to pull together the rest of the TPP after the United States withdrew and kind of held it together as a glue almost. So they are really, his legacies are really across the board of how Japan conducted and positioned itself in the world. So we have a few questions obviously trickling in. One of them is, again, we're going back to the impact of his decisions. One of the more controversial decision that Mr. Abe made was to reinterpret the Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution to authorize a little bit more flexibility for the self-defense forces when it comes to what it can and cannot do in various situations outside Japan. How do you see his consequences of decision continues to unfold today? Obviously, we already seen some of the direct fruits from it, of some of the policy decision that the Kishida government made. But this is for both of you. So whoever would like to go first.
May I go
You want to
first?
go? Yep.
Yes. When he decided to change the interpretation of the constitutional interpretation, I was out of the government. but I was a frequent visitor to his office almost every month. So we discussed these issues. And he wouldn't tell me exactly what he believed in, but I could guess that the following is my interpretation of what he might have thought. Of course, for him, the amendment to the Constitution it is the best option, but it requires a lot of political assets, and it could be extremely politically costly, and it may take a long, long time. And given the deteriorating strategic or geopolitical circumstances surrounding Japan, we cannot wait. We cannot wait for years to amend the constitution with the two-thirds sort of approval from both houses and the majority of the popular vote. That's almost, well, well, I would say theoretically possible, but politically not necessarily. So I think for Mr. Abe, the change of interpretation instead of change of wording of the Constitution was not his first option, of course. But he decided to do that because we had no time, and he did that just in time for the Trump administration. And he changed the Constitution interpretation so that at least he or we can say to the American friends and um, counterparts that under some circumstances we can defend U.S. forces, U.S. troops, and we can fight together under the new interpretation of the Constitution. That's probably the maximum we could do. And he knows that if he wants to go further, reaching a level of full-fledged sort of reciprocal reciprocity, then we may have to amend the Constitution, which requires a lot of political assets. So that's probably was a great breakthrough, but still he may not have been completely satisfied. That's my interpretation. I may be wrong.
Toby, do you have anything to add?
I think the thing about reinterpret, I think it took time for the importance to really be fully appreciated. I think if we think back to the debate in both in 2014 and 2015, both with the decision to reinterpret and then with the legal changes that came out of that, the discussion was very abstract. It was focused on these narrow cases where theoretically it could happen, and it was a debate in some ways where the government and opposition were talking past each other, where the government was saying, well, it'll be very limited. There's only a certain set of cases, and the opposition was making these extravagant claims that this was going to be a license to go to war. But I think as time has gone on, as the situation in the Taiwan Strait has changed, as the situation in the East China Sea has changed, South China Sea may be less relevant, but still part of the picture, that it's becoming maybe a little more clear what the stakes are, and that in terms of enabling the U.S. and Japanese militaries to plan and train and prepare for certain contingencies with the assumption that Japan will be able to fulfill certain roles in those crises, that actually is very important. But that wasn't what was talked about in 2015, right? There was no, it was sort of almost a deliberate effort to not be too focused on any specific scenario or contingency. But I think it has opened up new possibilities, new ways for bilateral cooperation. It's hard to imagine the kind of joint operations cooperation that that is now on the agenda, the bilateral agenda, as we speak, and U.S. and Japanese authorities figuring out how to have a cooperation on the ground between an operational U.S. commander and their SDF counterparts. All of that is difficult to imagine in the pre 2014 2015 world. And so, I mean, there are real consequences in a way that I think it took time to be apparent, but I think we're learning over time just how important those actually are. I mean, and I think just agreeing with Miyake-san that, I mean, I think clearly Abe would have wanted to go further, and there still are, I think, maybe frontiers. But I mean, I think the other maybe an important thing to note, and this again is one of these things that has become more apparent over time, but it's remarkable to think back 20 years or so when, you know, the focus was on, well, is Japan going to send troops to this overseas operation and that overseas operation? And what we've really seen, you know, dating over the past decade is, you know, a much more kind of laser sharp focus on Japan's security and its immediate surroundings, what it needs to do to defend itself and to contribute to kind of allied efforts in East Asia. And that, I mean, I think is it's been a positive development, you know, that this is focused on real strategic concerns and needs, and that in some ways the focus on kind of contributions to oversee all of that was something of a sideshow and almost even a cul-de-sac, and that really that now this is a much more constructive, productive conversation, in part because it has to be, because there are real strategic threats right in Japan's neighborhood that have to be met and deterred. And so it's in some ways Japan's national security discourse is in a better place now.
Thank you both. So when Prime Minister Kishida, Mr. Abe came back to the office, one of the things he said on the outset, right at the beginning of his administration, was he would like to take Japan, end Japan's Sengo post-war. So he would like to take Japan to post-Sengo. But there are specifically on two foreign policy issues, he couldn't quite do that while he was still with us. One is making a headway on Japan-Russia relations, including the Northern Ireland issues. And the other one is Japanese abductees into North Korea issue, where he's been known for years as one of the strongest supporter of the victims of those actions by North Korea. So, how do you think his successor, now Prime Minister Kishida, and moving forward? Obviously, now with a lot of geopolitical changes like Russia, North Korea rapprochement, things have quite changed for Japan, and that I think could be limiting Japan's options in those policy areas. But how do you see those areas? This is a little bit away from the reflection on Mr. Abe's legacy, but how do you see his successors moving this ball in these areas forward?
Well, it might be very difficult.
Yep. I know, that's a short answer.
Because Mr. Abe tried for years and spent a lot of years on that. But, you know, one thing I remember, I may not, I shouldn't share this with you, but when I was traveling in the Middle East, and I was just in the Istanbul, and I got a phone call from Tokyo, and that was Mr. Abe. He doesn't call me very often, and actually he didn't ask for advice or whatever help from me. I just volunteered to go there and have a chat with him that will make him hopefully happy. But at that time was different, and he wants to talk about Russia at that time. So I immediately, went back to Tokyo, and I told him, I cannot tell you what he said, but I can tell you what I said. I told him, I said, Mr. Abe, if I'm sure you were interested in, making progress in the Russo-Japanese negotiations on northern territories. But you see, you have to, I will support you if you can do the following. Mr. Abe, you have to convince Mr. Putin that Mr. Putin should think strategically. That means, from the strategic point of view, the longer-term threat to Russia may not come from Europe anymore. It may come from Asia, and it may come from his big neighbor. So if, Mr. Abe, you can convince Mr. Putin that Mr. Putin's strategic threat comes not from the West, but from the East, then that'll be when you can convince or you can persuade Mr. Putin to make some concessions with Japan. But in the end, my interpretation is that Mr. Putin was so obsessed with the threat from NATO, then he didn't pay due strategic attention to the relationship with Japan because he thought that he could handle the threat from China at that time. So what I wanted to tell you is that if Mr. Putin is obsessed, if he's obsessed with the NATO issues, it might have been so difficult for any Japanese prime minister to make progress in the Japan-Russia negotiations on territories. That's my take.
Toby, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes I think Abe is criticized for the effort he put towards Russia. But I mean the logic of it, and I as Miyake-san just laid out, I mean, I think there was a clear strategic logic. I think if you look back at the 2013 National Security Strategy and the section that's on Russia, I mean, it's very clear that that if you can drive a wedge between Russia and China, that would improve Japan's security. And it was certainly worth a try. I think the fundamental problem is, of course, is that you have a Russia that is fundamentally revisionist. I mean, and not even in a constructive sense. I mean, it's not even clear what order Russia would like to build, but it certainly wants to undermine and destroy the existing post-war order. And to the extent that Japan is firmly on the side of defending and upholding that order, because the alternative would be devastating for Japan, there's not a whole lot of room for Japan and Russia to get along. And the fact, and the meetings we've seen between Putin and Xi Jinping are, I mean, it's discouraging, and it shows that I mean, the instinct of that Abe had was right, that if Japan or if Russia and China draw closer together, that it's certainly not positive for Japan's security. But I mean, I guess I mean, if there was a downside to Abe's efforts, it was just maybe overestimating the possibility that Russia could be pried away from China's orbit. And the reality is that I mean, Putin, his motives seem fairly clear. And I mean, there's just not a whole lot for the Japanese government to work with now. And certainly with, Japan's G7 partners being firmly, opposed to Russia, there's also, it's not exactly easy for Japan at this point to pursue its own course with Russia. So.
Right. Great. Thank you for those thoughts. One of the countries in the world that Mr. Abe, there are a few countries that he really put in his personal stake in building a relationship and elevating Japan's relationship with those countries. And then one of them was India. How do you see his personal investment in building relationship with Prime Minister Modi, elevating it to, I guess, a strategic partnership? How is that now playing out in the Japan's foreign policy toolkit?
Well, India is extremely important to him. And when I accompanied him in his visit to India in 2006 or 7, I don't remember, he gave an important speech, which would eventually lead to the free and open Indo-Pacific.
That's the one that
So
confluence of two seas, right?
Right.
Yeah.
That's right. And at that time, it was even before the days of Prime Minister Modi. His sort of attachment, or we shouldn't say attachment, his interest in India is more instinctive, very, very, very much, because there's a reason for that. But at the same time, we shouldn't overestimate the presence of India in the forum like Quad. Unfortunately, Quad started making more progress after he retired. He resigned from the office of Prime Minister for the second time. But so I didn't have a chance to talk to him about the India very often. But my hunch is very simple. India will never be our ally. I'm not criticizing them, but India wants strong, independent India, period. So they don't need any ally. They may need friends, but they don't need allies. So, if we dream that we can keep India on our side as an ally, forget it. It won't happen. But what we can do within the context of the Quad is to prevent India from going too far to the other side. That's something we can do. But we cannot keep them on our side. And I think Mr. Abe understands that. So that's why his approach to India is very, very thoughtful and sophisticated. And it took a long time to convince India to come to us. See, because they are proud, independent India. But having said that, without the efforts of Mr. Abe, we could have had such a wonderful sort of Quad process going on.
Toby?
I'll just add to that. I think the notion that India doesn't want to be anyone's ally is absolutely right. I think one thing that we saw under Abe and have continued to see under his successors is sort of that Japan in some ways is better placed to approach India and to kind of coax India onto the side of kind of the rule-based order, in part because Japan, I think, fundamentally understands that it wants, sort of recognizes India as sort of a superpower in its own right, and demographically and economically, but it doesn't approach. I think when the United States approaches India, there's a lot of baggage. Sometimes, U.S. expectations tend to run ahead of reality, and there's certainly, I think, a patience that I think Abe understood and other Japanese leaders have understood, that sort of being realistic with expectations, not assuming that India is going to just limit its autonomy for your sake, and that I think that has definitely been a strength of Japan's foreign policy as far as India is concerned.
Thank you. During Mr. Abe's tenure, especially for the second one and before his retirement, there's this one relationship that he invested and put an effort to it, taking a pragmatic view, and it almost came to fruition, but kind of botched by COVID, which is his effort to maintain some kind of a constructive relationship and engagement with China. As we recall, state visit by Xi Jinping was agreed upon, but it had to be canceled because of the COVID. So this is, you should never say like what ifs, but does either of you care to kind of think about what if that state visit actually had come through? Let's say, minus COVID, Xi Jinping made a state visit to Tokyo. Do you think that could have had any impact on the dynamics in the region and maybe on the U.S.-China U.S.-China strategic competition? Maybe I'll go to you, Toby. Since I've been referring to like the examples.
I start with
okay.
Well, we I think the invitation to Mr. Xi Jinping is still on, I guess.
I believe so.
Uh,
Yeah.
but because we never take it back.
No, it's for them to
But
accept. Yeah.
but I don't think they, they're simply because uh, for China, I'm not representing any government, but for China, the most important foreign policy objective is to have better relationship with the United States. That's the strategic goal of their foreign policy. So within the context of China-U.S. relations, China-Japan relations are one of the um, uh, dependent variable, not the independent variable. So that's why probably even if had we don't have even if we haven't had COVID, probably the visit itself will not uh, be as constructive and substantive as we might have wished. Simply because of the sort of a U.S. Japan China sort of a triangle sort of triangular relations. Therefore, my conclusion is that even now, I'm sure we should continue dialogue, pursue a dialogue with the Chinese leaders, simply because we don't want them to make strategic mistakes. And I always say to my audience that even a smart dictator like Mr. Putin made such a huge strategic mistake. If that's the case, there are at least two similar dictators in our neighborhood. One is big and one is small. I don't want to name, but if one of them made a similar strategic mistake as Mr. Putin did, then we may have a war. So we don't want that. Then the best way for dictators to avoid making mistakes is to keep them informed of the correct pieces of information. In order to do that, we should continue dialogue with those leaders at the top level, at the summit level, not the administrative level alone. So that's why I am not pessimistic, but not optimistic either.
Toby?
Yeah, so I mean, without speculating on the what if the Xi visit had gone ahead, I mean, but it is, I mean, I think it maybe is or maybe a misunderstood part of his legacy, and this goes back to something Miyake said earlier, that that Abe, is viewed as this hawk, and I mean, but that is not the whole story by any means. That there was a strategic vision, a sense of realism. And, if you look at the memoir that was published posthumously, and I don't have the exact quote off the top of my head, but I mean, he said, the responsibility of a serious statesman is, is being able to talk to China, and that it's no use just pointing at, the bad things they do or their military power, and that being able to communicate with them, being able to sit across the table with them, and you do it from a position of strength. And I think that was something that he was adamant about, but that Japan didn't have the luxury of not talking to China. And so even if there are obstacles to serious forward progress, and the days maybe there's not really going to be any going back to what the relationship was like. For example, when he first became prime minister and made his trip to Beijing, and the atmosphere has changed, the obstacles are greater, the sort of challenge of balancing between security, competition, deterrence, and having some sort of stable economic relationship is harder than ever. But just because it's hard doesn't mean that it's not an important priority for a Japanese politician, a Japanese prime minister, and that was something that he fundamentally, I think, understood. And it's something that I think he has imparted to his successors as well. And so that I think that remains a part of Japan's national strategy, and it's something that I think is probably underappreciated from his tenure.
Yeah, and then when you think about, his successor, Prime Ministers, Suga and Kishida, the way that they decided to, basically invest more time in a China, Japan, Korea triad, for example, you do see that playing out, right? Like, how Japan does, like, Korea also, but, those two US allies really have to balance carefully. But bottom line is Tokyo or Seoul doesn't have an option of not engaging China at all. So there's still, there will be a continued effort to engage Beijing in whatever the way possible. So an hour is drawing to a close. In fact, I just look at my watch and it's 10 o'clock sharp. So last one is a little bit more forward looking. So as we both all know, including the audience, US presidential election is in a very interesting place today. The place that we never thought we would be in 2 weeks ago. And a lot of people say in Tokyo that Japan fared, weathered under Mr. Trump's first time in the office, almost single-handedly, thanks to Prime Minister Abe's ability to communicate and engage. And in Miyake-san's word, disarm Mr. Trump as an outset to have a close relationship. Looking at today's Japanese political landscape, should there be, I would say should, I would like to emphasize should, hypothetically, for President Trump 2.0 administration, who would be able to try to play the function that Mr. Abe played back then? I will give it to you, Toby, first. Or maybe if Miyake-san wants to go first.
Yeah, because I want Toby to go last.
Okay.
Nobody can do that. Because we lost Shinzo already. And but there are some ways for the leaders all over the world how to deal with the Donald Trump too, because we have 4 years or more of experience in dealing with him, and many foreign leaders thought about it, wrote about it, so we have enough pieces of information about how to deal with them. But so I will leave it to Toby about the about Mr. Trump,
singling out something, naming names, right?
Japanese politicians. But what I'm
Right.
worried about is this. I'm not supposed to say this, but 2 years later, after the assassination of Mr. Abe, I am beginning to realize that the days of the legacy of, well, I shouldn't say legacy, days of the era of Shinzo Abe are ending. Okay, whether you like it or not. And because of the political, I wouldn't say turmoil, but this political sort of developments in Japan, we should be much more concerned about the current situation in Japan, not only in Washington, the United States. You see, I'm afraid to say that Japan's post-World War II conservative politics or conservative governance is at the crossroad, and we don't know in which way we are headed for. And so the so-called scandal we are facing in Tokyo is one of the symptoms. But and it's happening in Europe, it's happening in the United States, and the conservative politics is deteriorating. So that's what I'm much more worried about than the Mr. Trump's second term.
And of course, before the show, we were talking about the recently ended, literally last night, ended the Tokyo gubernatorial elections, and what we should get out of that results. But that is another symptom, whether depend, whether you agree or disagree with the election result, whether you like it or not, here it is. But then what do we get out of it? And I think, Toby, I think you and I can have like another show talking, dissecting all that, voting blocks and everything. But without that, we'll save it for another time. But Toby, anybody who can possibly try to do half of what Mr. Abe was successful.
Well, yeah, so we could definitely do an hour on the circumstances that enable Abe to govern like he did are changing pretty dramatically. But anyway, setting that aside, I might be at least as skeptical or maybe even more skeptical than Miyake-san about the ability that the LDP or that the LDP or that the Japanese political system, if they just get the right leader, things will be fine. And it's two factors. One, I think, Trump is, if he was unpredictable the first time around, I think it's even more unpredictable this time around. And I think, the potential adverse scenarios for Japan, I think are potentially greater this time around. And so in some ways the stakes are greater, but also I think it's important, that I think Abe had a very important role to play in late 2016 after the election and in 2017 and into 2018. But I think there were diminishing returns from his personal diplomacy. I think by the time Trump started talking with North Korea and then threatening automobile tariffs if Japan didn't start negotiating a bilateral FTA, that we were already seeing that as Trump got more comfortable, the ability of Abe to, yes, you didn't see the very worst outcomes from those scenarios. So maybe, Abe mattered in terms of avoiding, kind of steering Trump away from some particularly bad outcomes for Japan. But I don't necessarily think that was because of his personal diplomacy over time, that it seemed that had progressively less influence over the things that Trump did. I think actually what will matter is less about this politician or that politician, and probably more just the professionalism of the Japanese foreign ministry, the effort they've put into relationships, not even with Trump, but with people sort of in his circle, with Republicans on the Hill. Japan does have a lot of friends in lots of different places around DC. And so the idea, it's hard to see Japan bearing the brunt of Trump's anger in the way that maybe some other countries have reason to be concerned about, in part because I think Japan does have friends. It has worked on that, and it has those relationships. And those relationships in some ways, with people who might actually, who might be able to speak to Trump on Japan's behalf might matter at least as much as a direct relationship with Trump. And so I think that matters. And I think the professionals in the Japanese government have worked on that for a number of years. So that might prove more important.
So on that cautiously positive note, I would like to thank both of you for this hour of conversation. It was really, I guess, appropriate, I thought, to reflect on his legacy, not just about policy, but him as a person, as a politician, and then as a statesman. So this was, I really appreciate both of your thoughts, and especially Miyake-san, thank you for sharing some of those personal stories that you really, I don't think many of us have, very few of us have ever have ever had the chance to hear. And thank you for everyone. For those of you who are tuning in from the United States, have a great rest of Monday, despite the heat waves. For those of you who are tuning in from Japan and other parts of Asia, have a good rest of the evening. And hopefully you are not going through the similar heat wave that we are over here. But with that, thank you again all for joining. And this concludes the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to all of you listening to and watching us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have a good day.